He was sitting in a ditch, bleeding, begging for mercy. Seconds later, Muammar Gaddafi, the man who ruled Libya for 42 years, was gone, not by a courtroom verdict, not by exile, but by a mob of rebels armed with smartphones and NATO air cover. His death wasn't just the chaotic end of a dictator, it was the unraveling of an entire country, and possibly the final chapter in a secret war most people still don't understand. Because to really grasp why NATO and the US took him down, we have to go deeper, much deeper. At first glance, Gaddafi looked like just another strongman, military uniform, fiery speeches, iron grip on power. But underneath all the flamboyance was a man who was both wildly erratic and dangerously ambitious. He called himself a revolutionary, someone who would unite the Arab world and free Africa from the grip of Western colonizers. He nationalized oil companies, kicked out American and British military bases, and even tried to create a single African currency backed by gold. The West hated him. In the 1980s, President Reagan labeled him the mad dog of the Middle East. The CIA even tried to overthrow him in covert operations. And when a Berlin nightclub was bombed, killing 2 American soldiers, the US blamed Gaddafi and bombed his house. His adopted daughter was killed in the strike. But despite the hatred, the West never managed to finish him off. At least, not yet. And if you think this was just personal vengeance, you're missing the bigger game because the stakes were much higher than Gaddafi himself. In the early 2000s, something changed. Gaddafi went from international pariah to photo ops with Tony Blair and handshakes with George W. Bush. He agreed to give up weapons of mass destruction and paid compensation for past terrorist attacks. But behind the scenes he was working on something much more dangerous than weapons, a financial rebellion. Gaddafi was preparing to launch a new currency for Africa, a gold-backed dinar. He wanted African nations to sell their oil and resources using this currency instead of the US dollar or euro. In short, he wanted to replace the global financial system with one built on African independence. And here's where it gets serious. More than 40% of France's electricity came from uranium mined in Africa. Much of it came from countries Gaddafi had strong ties with. If they ditched the euro and started demanding payment in gold dinars, it would upend everything. This wasn't just economic reform, it was a revolution, and revolutions threaten power. Western intelligence knew about the plan. In a leaked 2011 email from Hillary Clinton's private server, the Gold Dinar project was described as a major motivating factor for France's push to intervene in Libya. But that wasn't the only reason NATO was watching Libya like a hawk. By 2011, the Arab Spring was sweeping across the Middle East. Tunisia's leader was already gone. Egypt's Mubarak was on the ropes. Protesters in Libya were emboldened. Gaddafi responded the only way he knew how, with brute force. Snipers on rooftops, airstrikes on civilians, tanks rolling into restive cities like Benghazi. Hundreds were dead. Thousands more were fleeing. It was a humanitarian crisis, and the world was watching. Or at least, that's how it looked on TV. But here's what most people missed. The rebellion was heavily armed almost from the start. Libyan army units defected, weapons flowed in from across the border, and the so-called freedom fighters were not some unified democratic front. They were a messy alliance of tribes, militias, and Islamist factions. Still, this gave NATO the perfect excuse. On March 17, 2011, the UN approved a no-fly zone to protect civilians. 2 days later, NATO jets were in the sky, launching airstrikes under the banner of humanitarian intervention. But what started as protecting civilians quickly became something else entirely. When NATO first stepped in, the goal was clear: stop Gaddafi from slaughtering his own people. But within weeks, that mission began to shift. Instead of just targeting military assets near civilians, NATO began hitting Gaddafi's inner circle, his compound, his military convoy, even his personal security. The message was no longer stop the killing, it was regime change. And here's the catch: regime change wasn't approved by the UN resolution. But by then, no one cared. The war had taken on a momentum of its own. France and the UK were leading the bombing campaign. The US was leading from behind, but still providing critical intelligence and drones. Weapons were flowing to rebels who had no central command, no clear leadership, and often very different visions for Libya's future. This wasn't just a war, it was a gamble. And as the rebels closed in on Gaddafi's final stronghold in Sirte, one final push would seal the West's victory and Libya's fate. October 20, 2011, Gaddafi tries to flee Sirte in a convoy. NATO spots it. French jets bomb it. Gaddafi escapes the vehicle but ends up hiding in a culvert by the roadside. Minutes later, rebel fighters find him. The footage of what happens next is raw and chaotic. Gaddafi is beaten, taunted, and eventually executed. His body is dragged through the streets like a trophy. NATO calls the mission a success. Hillary Clinton famously says, "We came, we saw, he died." But beneath the celebration was something far darker, because with Gaddafi gone, there was no plan for what came next, and what followed was worse than anyone had imagined. The day Gaddafi died, Libya didn't become a democracy, it became a vacuum. The rebels turned into rival warlords. Militias took over cities. ISIS gained a foothold. Weapons from Gaddafi's vast arsenal spilled across Africa, fueling conflicts in Mali, Nigeria, and beyond. Tens of thousands of migrants flooded toward Europe, fleeing the chaos NATO helped create. Libya became a hub for human trafficking, slave markets, and lawless violence. Even Barack Obama would later call the Libya intervention the worst mistake of his presidency, not because of the military action itself, but because of the complete lack of planning for the aftermath. In other words, the mission succeeded, the country failed, but here's the twist. Some believe this failure wasn't an accident at all. What if this wasn't about democracy, or human rights, or protecting civilians? What if it was about control? Gaddafi was one of the last leaders in Africa who refused to bow to Western financial systems. He openly criticized the IMF and World Bank. He backed rebels across the continent. He pushed for African unity under African terms. To some, he was a megalomaniac. To others, a visionary. Either way, he was a problem. Emails later revealed Francis Sarkozy had 5 key reasons for launching the intervention. Only one was humanitarian. The rest were about oil, influence, and stopping Gaddafi's financial ambitions. In the end, Gaddafi threatened too many powerful interests. He wasn't just fighting rebels in Benghazi. He was fighting the invisible hand of a global system that doesn't tolerate disobedience. And once that war began, it didn't matter who fired the final shot. Muammar Gaddafi's death wasn't just the fall of a dictator. It was the collapse of a country, the start of a new era of proxy warfare, and a warning to any leader who dares to defy the established order. He died in a ditch. But the real story? That started long before the first NATO jet took off, and it's still being written today. Because in the shadow of Gaddafi's downfall, the question lingers, was this liberation or liquidation? If you like documentaries like this, subscribe to our channel is a huge help. See you in the next video.